Before nations existed, before languages clashed, before borders cut the earth into pieces, humanity was one people, one tongue, one culture, one mind. And that unity became our greatest danger. The ancient world remembers a moment when humanity stood together with a single ambition, not to worship God, but to replace Him. They built a city to control the earth and a tower to challenge the heavens. Not a monument, but a weapon, a doorway, a declaration. The prophets describe the sky darkening over that city, the air tightening, the ground trembling beneath the feet of a unified race, marching toward a single purpose, to seize the power that once belonged only to heaven. In that hour, humanity crossed a line it was never meant to cross, a threshold only heaven could see, a point where our unity became violent, where our ambition became suicidal, where our rebellion became unstoppable. And heaven moved, not with flood, not with fire, not with war, but with a judgment far more devastating. Heaven shattered humanity. In a single moment, minds were torn apart, families split without warning, languages collided and fractured like glass, and the one race that had filled the earth was suddenly transformed into 70 nations, each with its own tongue, its own destiny, its own boundaries, carved by the hand of God. The world remembers this event as chaos, but the prophets call it mercy, a violent mercy that saved humanity from itself. For if heaven had not broken us, we would have reached the heavens and destroyed the earth long before our time. Tonight, we go back to the day unity died, the day heaven intervened, the day humanity was divided, not by evolution or migration or climate, but by a divine act so sudden, so catastrophic, that its shockwaves still shape the world today. This is the hidden story behind the nations, the moment when humanity became different races, different peoples, different identities, each set on a path chosen in a plowing, single night. And as you will soon see, the earth has never healed from what happened, because the split was not the end. It was only the beginning. Before the split, the world with one race, one voice, one mind. In the earliest days after the flood, the earth was quiet. Civilizations had not yet scattered. Languages had not diverged. No tribes claimed deserts or mountains or rivers. No nations drew lines across the continents. No kingdoms rose to fight for dominance. Humanity was a single body, one race, breathing with one voice. They lived together on the same plane, moving in the same direction, thinking the same thoughts, not divided by culture, not divided by color, not divided by memory or identity. There were no strangers then, only one people. But the prophet saw something underneath that unity, something no one else saw. Unity, in the hands of a righteous humanity, is strength, but unity, in the hands of a corrupt humanity, is the most dangerous force on earth. The ancient writings hint at a disturbing truth. Humanity was not unified around goodness. It was unified around pride, around ambition, around rebellion. And rebellion is far more powerful when no one disagrees. They shared a single tongue not only in language but in intention. Every whisper echoed into agreement. Every idea became a collective desire. Every dream became a shared mission. Their hearts moved in unison. Their minds followed the same path. Their desires fed each other like fire on dry grass. It was not harmony. It was acceleration, a dangerous synchronization of human will. And at the center of this unbroken unity stood a man whose ambition stretched beyond the horizon, a ruler who convinced a world with no nations that they could become gods. The prophets never name him in soft tones. They speak of a man defined by hunger, hunger for dominion, hunger for immortality, hunger to build a throne high enough to challenge heaven itself. Under his influence, the unified race began to transform, not physically, but spiritually. The people turned their collective genius toward a single goal: to build a city that would gather all humanity under one rule, and a tower that would pierce the heavens with its defiance. Because the unity of humanity was not peace, it was a weapon aimed upward. The prophets described the tension of that age with chilling clarity. The whole world had one language and one purpose, and nothing they planned would be withheld from them. Nothing. No barrier, no limit, no restraint. Humanity was becoming unstoppable, not by technology, but by unity, unbound by conscience. The people marched as one. They built as one. They envisioned a world without borders, without limits, without heaven's authority. A world where humanity was the highest power. Their unity was not harmony. It was acceleration toward a precipice. And heaven watched a single realization unfold. If humanity remained one race, one voice, one will, they would reach the forbidden heights long before their time. They would break the boundary between earth and heaven. They would seize knowledge not meant for them. They would rebuild the same corruption that destroyed the ancient world before the flood, this time with coordination and limitless ambition. This was not unity. This was a runaway force, a single human race, moving in one direction so violently that heaven had only two choices: destroy the world again, or shatter the unity that made destruction inevitable. And so the prophets say that heaven prepared an intervention so decisive, so catastrophic, so permanent, that the world still lives inside its consequences today, because one unified humanity was the most dangerous empire Earth had ever seen, and to save the world, God would have to split it. The next section unveils the first crack in that unity, the moment heaven marked the city where humanity's ambition had reached its breaking point, the city that tried to replace heaven. The unified world did not drift into rebellion. It marched toward it deliberate, organized, unstoppable. The prophets say there was a place where all humanity gathered in a single pulse of ambition, a plain wide enough for millions, flat enough for construction, fertile enough to sustain a people who had one voice and one dream. They called it Shinar. No one today knows the exact borders, but the ancient world remembered it as a place where the soil was black and heavy, where brick hardened like stone, where the ground itself seemed eager to build monuments. There, at the heart of that plain, humanity made a decision that would define the fate of every race that would ever exist. They would build a city where all people lived together under one ruler, one culture, one language, a single human empire that no force could divide. And in the center of that city, they would build something else, a structure no generation before them had ever dared to imagine. A tower that would reach the heavens, not a tower of height, not a monument of pride, but a threshold, a ziggurat built with spiritual intention, a stairway designed to bring divine beings down and lift humanity up, a gateway between worlds, a bold attempt to erase the boundary God Himself had placed between heaven and earth. The prophets describe the atmosphere of that city with words that shake with tension. Let us build a tower with its top in the heavens. That was not architecture. It was theology. It was rebellion. It was humanity declaring, "We will ascend. We will unify all power. We will make a name for ourselves that even heaven cannot erase." And so the people marched with the confidence of a race that believed nothing could stop them. They learned to fire brick until it gleamed red like blood. They discovered mortar that bound stone tighter than bone. They built foundations thicker than fortresses. Their hands moved in rhythm. Their voices rose in unison. Their ambition gathered into something beyond politics and beyond kingship, a global will, a hunger that fed itself on unity. They did not build the tower out of curiosity. They built it out of defiance. This was not a house for God. This was humanity's attempt to force its way into heaven's realm and stand as equals. The prophets saw what humanity did not. As the tower grew, so did the spiritual corruption beneath it. Every brick was soaked in pride. Every level was built with defiance. Every voice that cried out, "Let us make a name for ourselves," echoed the same ancient arrogance that destroyed the world before the flood. The unified race had learned nothing. Together, they had become more dangerous than any tyrant, any empire, any kingdom humanity would ever produce again. Because one nation can rebel, but one humanity rebelling together is unstoppable. And God said something the world still trembles to read. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Not because humanity had power, but because humanity had unity. And unity in rebellion is the most destructive force on earth. The city of Shinar became a ticking bomb, a spiritual weapon nearing completion, a tower rising like a spear aimed at the sky, a united race preparing to take what was forbidden. Heaven did not move immediately. Heaven waited until the structure reached a point from which humanity could not turn back. The prophets say that when the tower reached its critical stage, a shadow passed over the city, not of cloud, but of judgment, because the next act from heaven would not target the tower. It would target the unity that built it. The next section reveals the moment heaven descended into the city, not to bless it, but to break the single human race into 70 nations in a single day. When heaven stepped into the city of man, something changed in Shinar, long before the people noticed it. The tower kept rising. The bricks kept burning. The voices kept chanting. The city kept swelling with ambition. But the air shifted. The prophets describe it as a crack in reality, a tremor not felt by the body but by the soul. The noise of the city fell flat, as if swallowed by an invisible ceiling. The wind stopped moving. Animals grew restless. Children cried without reason. Older men felt a weight in their chest, as though the sky itself had descended upon them. The city didn't know it yet, but heaven had arrived. Not gently, not with music, not with angels descending in light, but with a silence so heavy that every heartbeat felt exposed. The ancient writings say, "The Lord came down to see the city and the tower," not because God needed to inspect their work, but because judgment always begins with divine presence. Heaven stepped into the human world like a storm entering a valley, unseen at first, but inevitable. The people felt it long before they saw anything. Voices cracked mid-sentence. Hands trembled as if the tools had turned to ice. The unity of their minds, once their greatest strength, began to flicker. Something was happening inside their thoughts. A thread was being loosened. A bond was being cut. The prophets say it was the moment God touched the collective mind of humanity, a mind that had become too synchronized, too powerful, too unified in rebellion. He did not strike the tower. He did not strike the leader. He did not strike the city. He struck the voice, the single voice of humanity, the one language that made rebellion unstoppable. The moment heaven entered the city, the foundations of human unity began to fracture, not physically, but spiritually. People suddenly hesitated when speaking. Words felt foreign in their own mouths. The young stuttered. The old muttered. Thoughts tangled. Instructions faltered. The rhythm of unified labor collapsed into confusion like a body having a seizure. But that was only the beginning. The true breaking had not yet begun. Heaven did not come as a warrior or a destroyer or a storm. Heaven came as a divider. The prophets described the instant God touched the language of humanity as a cosmic rupture, a divine shattering. One moment, the city roared with a single anthem, a single tongue, a single purpose. The next, the sound of the city broke into pieces. Voices splintered into dozens of languages at once. Words twisted into new forms. Sentences dissolved. Brothers heard strangers in the voices of their own blood. Fathers and sons looked at one another and realized they no longer shared meaning. Panic spread like fire. Groups formed by instinct, drawn together by familiar sounds. Others scattered in terror, unable to understand the chaos around them. The unity that made humanity unstoppable was erased in a moment, not violently, but surgically. Heaven had reached into the human mind and cut the world into 70 tribes in the space of a breath. The leader who unified the world shouted commands, but no one understood him anymore. His words fell to the ground like stones dropped into the ocean. The city that once synchronized its heartbeat now pulsed with confusion, agony, identity shattering. Families realized they were divided. Alliances snapped. Work halted. Construction froze mid-stroke. Arguments erupted in dozens of tongues. Hands that once cooperated now pushed each other away. The prophets described the scene as humanity's first psychological earthquake, where the foundation of shared meaning collapsed beneath the feet of millions. This was the moment heaven made its decision final. Humanity would no longer walk as one people. Their unity had become too dangerous, their ambition too violent, their trajectory too catastrophic. To save the world, God split it, and Shinar became the epicenter of the greatest fracture in human history. The next section reveals the aftermath of the rupture, how 70 new nations were born from the ruins, and how the first races of humanity emerged from a single night of divine intervention. The night 70 nations were born. When the language of humanity shattered, the city did not collapse immediately. It pulsed with chaos, a living body convulsing after a strike to the heart. People clutched their heads as though a blade had sliced through their thoughts. Words poured from their mouths like strangers, unfamiliar even to themselves. It was not sound that split the world. It was identity. Because language is not speech. Language is mind, memory, culture, worldview, destiny. And when heaven split the human voice, it split everything. The prophets say, the world became 70 fragments in one night. Not slowly, not through migration, not through climate or evolution, but through a divine act. that sliced humanity into 70 distinct peoples, each with a destiny carved into them by God Himself. The first divisions were not physical, they were psychological. Certain groups could suddenly understand one another. Others heard nothing but noise. Some were drawn together by instinct. Others pulled apart, as if repelled by an invisible force. A mother speaking one language looked into the eyes of her child and realized their souls no longer matched. Two brothers, identical in face, were strangers in voice. The unity of humanity had died, and a world of nations was being born like stars exploding into separate galaxies. The people gathered themselves into clusters, not by planning, but by panic. Tiny tribes formed on the plain, groups huddling together because they recognized each other's words, each other's fears, each other's cries. Little nations were forming in the shadows of a collapsing tower. Some groups clung to the ruins, hoping the confusion would fade. Others fled in terror, running from the sound of unfamiliar tongues. But it was no passing chaos. It was the new order of tongues, the world. And heaven watched as humanity pulled itself apart into 70 fragments of the original whole. The prophets list their names, not to preserve history, but to reveal destiny. From these 70 clans came the 70 ancient nations, the fathers of races, the roots of cultures, the seeds of continents. Each group carried a new identity, a language that shaped thought, a worldview that shaped belief, a memory that shaped tradition, a fear that shaped migration. These clusters did not simply walk away. They were drawn away north, south, east, west, as though invisible hands guided their paths. Some were pulled toward mountains, some toward valleys, some toward forests, some toward deserts, some toward coasts, some toward islands still unknown. Their journeys were not decisions, they were assignments. The prophets say that the God who fractured their unity also set their boundaries, drawing invisible lines across the earth that no nation could cross until their destined time. Every group carried within them a different thread of the original human potential, different talents, different fears, different strengths, different futures. Language became culture. Culture became habit. Habit became identity. Identity became lineage. Lineage became race. Not biological in an instant, but psychological, spiritual, cultural, generational, and over centuries. Each group shaped its world and was shaped by it. The people of warm lands became different from the people of cold lands. The people of mountains became different from the people of plains. The people of forests became different from the people of deserts. Isolation created uniqueness. Uniqueness created divergence. Divergence created races. But every race, every tribe, every people, every nation, all began in a single night of divine intervention. The night God split humanity to save humanity. The night Shinar became the cradle of nations. The night the world's borders were drawn by the hand no map can show. The prophets say that the 70 nations did not walk into history alone. Each group carried a spiritual assignment, not a curse, not favoritism, not hierarchy, but a role in the great unfolding story of the world. Some were given lands, some were given languages, some were given strength, some were given wisdom, some were given endurance, some were given creativity, some were given influence, some were given protection. Each nation received something different, something heaven designed for their path. Because the split was not random, it was intentional, purposeful, necessary, a divine fracture that shaped every border, every race, every culture, every story that would ever be told. The next section reveals how these nations scattered across the earth and how the races that define the world today were formed from the 70 destinies born that night. The scattering, how the first races took shape across the earth when the 70 nations rose from the ashes of Shinar. None of them knew where they were going. None knew why they felt drawn in different directions. None understood the invisible hands, steering them like rivers cut into the landscape by forces above nature. The prophets say it was not migration, it was assignment. A divine current pulled each group toward the lands written for them since the foundations of the world. The plain of Shinar became a crossroads of destiny, a place where humanity turned away from unity and stepped into a world of nations. Some groups turned toward the sunrise, eyes drawn to the warm wind and the endless stretches of land beyond the horizon. Others turned toward the cold, toward mountains that tore the sky, toward high places where strength would be forged in the shadow of ice and stone. Others felt a pull toward the sea, toward the edges of the known world, toward coastlines and islands where the sound of waves would shape their story. And others yet were guided toward forests, deep green and ancient, where the trees stood like pillars in temples older than human memory. Each group walked away from Shinar with a different language and a different future. They carried only what heaven allowed: their families, their fears, their instincts, their breath. But each group carried something else, something unseen, a divine imprint that would shape their destiny and become the foundation of the world's races. The prophets describe the scattering as a storm that moved across the earth, not a storm of wind, but of humanity, a wave of tribes spreading outward in every direction, their footsteps echoing with the shock of their sudden separation. As they moved, the land itself began to mold them. Those drawn south encountered heat that wrapped itself around their bodies like fire. They learned to survive under the burning sun, their skin darkening with strength and endurance. Their culture built on rhythms of survival in lands where life demanded toughness. Those who journeyed north found themselves in a world carved by frost. Ice cut into their breath, mountains hardened their bodies, and silent winters forged resilience that would define their identity for generations. Those who settled in the east found vast plains and endless horizons. Migrations across these lands wove discipline into their culture, precision into their minds, endurance into their bones. Those who moved west encountered coasts, cliffs, and the restless power of the sea, and their cultures became marked by exploration, ambition, and the desire to carve their mark upon distant lands. But the shaping was not physical alone. It was spiritual. Each group carried a unique thread of the original unity, specific talents, specific inclinations, specific strengths, written into them long before they stepped onto the earth. Some were given the gift of leadership, the instinct to build kingdoms and influence nations. Others were given the gift of artistry to create beauty from stone, sound, and imagination. Others were given the gift of endurance to survive in lands where the earth tested their limits. Others were given the gift of wisdom to preserve knowledge through ages of darkness. Others were given the gift of adaptability to thrive wherever their feet touched the earth. These divine distributions became the seeds of civilizations. The prophets say that nations were not born equal in role or responsibility, but each was born purposeful. Each land shaped its people. Each people shaped its destiny. Each destiny shaped its contribution to the story of humanity. And this shaping, this fusion of divine assignment and earthly circumstance, became the beginning of the world's races, not as divisions of superiority, but as expressions of design, distinct, not unequal, different, not opposed, purposed, not accidental. The scattering was not punishment. It was protection, the creation of diversity so humanity could no longer unite in rebellion. And across centuries, the 70 nations grew into civilizations, some mighty, some hidden, some violent, some wise, but none of them forgot the night their ancestors walked away from Shinar, under skies split by divine power. Every border today, every nation, every heritage, every racial identity traces back to that single rupture. The next section reveals how these scattered nations became rivals, how ancient hostilities were born, and how the divisions created that night still shape the politics, wars, and tensions of the modern world. The birth of rivalry. When nations learned to fear each other, the 70 new nations did not part as enemies. They parted as strangers, and strangers, when wounded by confusion, become fearful. Fear, left unhealed, becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes division. Division becomes rivalry. Rivalry becomes hatred. Hatred becomes history. This was how the world's ancient conflicts began, not through war, but through memory. Each group carried the story of the night. Unity died. A story filled with trauma, the shock of sudden separation, the terror of lost understanding, the shattering of family bonds, the grief of hearing your own brother's voice become incomprehensible. Each nation's first memory was rejection, not chosen by God but carved by His hand into a destiny they did not understand. The prophets say the first emotion humanity felt after the split was not anger, it was abandonment. And abandonment does not remain silent. It becomes identity. The 70 nations walked away from Shinar with wounds deeper than blood, invisible fractures in the human heart that would define how they saw one another for thousands of years. The nations who traveled north remembered the confusion as a kind of betrayal. They hardened themselves against the world, determined never again to trust anyone outside their own tribe. The nations who moved east carried the fear of chaos like a shadow. They built structure, discipline, and order to protect themselves from the uncertainty that shattered their ancestors' world. The nations who migrated south remembered the pain of being thrust into exile. They forged resilience in heat, hunger, and endurance, gaining strength from survival. The nations who journeyed west became driven by ambition, seeking control in a world that once slipped through their hands. The prophets say that each race carried a different wound, a different psychological scar from the night of the split. Not curses, wounds. Wounds that shaped how they saw strangers. Wounds that shaped how they built societies. Wounds that shaped how they treated outsiders. Wounds that shaped how they responded to power. These wounds became the roots of the world's first conflicts. When one tribe encountered another, when two languages met on the plains, when two cultures crossed paths in forests, deserts, and mountains, neither trusted the other. Suspicion flared like sparks. Defensive instincts sharpened. Territories were guarded. Resources contested. Boundaries enforced. A glance became a warning. A misunderstanding became a threat. A threat became a fight. A fight became legend. Legend became law. Law became tradition. And tradition became the world's first hatreds. These hatreds were not born from difference. They were born from fear. Fear of repeating the trauma the nation suffered at Shinar. Fear of betrayal. Fear of domination. Fear of losing identity again. Fear of being swallowed by a rival tribe. The prophets describe this era as the age of first blood, when humanity learned not just to be different, but to defend its difference with violence. No empire existed yet. No kings. No armies. No borders drawn by ink. But every tribe carried a boundary drawn by fear. Every race carried a memory of division. And heaven knew that these wounds would echo through ages of conquest, slavery, war, prejudice, and pride. Because the unity humanity had lost was never restored, and the diversity humanity had gained was never understood. The 70 nations, once brothers in the same city, now stood across valleys as strangers. Their paths diverged, their cultures solidified, their identities hardened, their divisions deepened, and the earth became a map of tensions that would shape every conflict in human history. The next section reveals the most astonishing truth hidden in ancient prophecy, that the split was never meant to be permanent, and that one day the 70 nations will be reunited in a way the world has never seen. The prophecy of return. When the nations become one again, the 70 nations did not scatter forever. Their exile was not the end. Their wounds were not the final chapter. Their divisions were not permanent, because hidden inside the ancient writings is a secret almost no one sees. The God who shattered humanity also promised to restore it. The split was judgment, but the reunion will be glory. The prophets speak of a future age when the nations, the races born at Shinar, will walk back toward one another, not through conquest, not through empire, not through domination, but through a divine call that draws them together in a unity humanity has never known. Not the unity of rebellion, not the unity of pride, not the unity of ambition, a unity built on healing. The ancient texts describe a breathtaking scene. All nations will come from the ends of the earth and speak with one voice. A reversal of Babel, a return to the unity humanity once had, but purified from the rebellion that corrupted it. The prophets saw a day when borders will fail to divide, hatred will lose its power, languages will become bridges instead of walls, races will see each other without fear, tribes will gather without rivalry, and humanity will stand together again, not against heaven, but under heaven. They saw the 70 nations return to the place where their story shattered, not physically, but spiritually, to be healed by the one who divided them. They saw the wounds from Shinar finally close, wounds carried in cultures, wounds carried in histories, wounds carried in bloodlines, wounds carried in memories, so old they became instincts. Everything the split damaged: identity, belonging, trust, peace will be restored. And the prophets describe something even more astonishing. Each nation will bring the gift that heaven gave them on the night of the split: their endurance, their creativity, their wisdom, their resilience, their strength, their artistry, their leadership, their passion, their discipline, their courage. Everything humanity has become: the beauty of its differences, the brilliance of its diversity, the richness of its cultures. All will be gathered into a single tapestry, woven not by rebellion but by redemption. The world that rose from Shinar was born in fear. The world that will rise in the end will be born in healing. Humanity began as one and became 70. But the prophets say that in the final age, the 70 will become one again, not by erasing their differences, but by uniting their destinies. One race, not by ancestry, but by purpose. One voice, not by language, but by harmony. One people, not by blood, but by belonging. The story that began with division will end with restoration. The moment humanity feared the most, the loss of unity, was always leading to a day when unity would return in a form the world has never seen. This is the hidden story behind the nations. That God split the races so humanity would not destroy itself, and He will reunite them so humanity can finally become what it was meant to be. And when that day comes, every race, every nation, every people will stand together not in rebellion, but in awe, as the wounds of Shinar are healed forever.